Innovating Education Learning World in association with WISE, an initiative of Qatar Foundation.
The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's latest report finds that 42% of American adults have some higher education, but it's lagging behind compared to countries like Canada and Japan. Why? Is legislation to blame, or the economic crisis, or both? And what can be done? That's this week on Learning World's USA Special. The No Child Left Behind Act was President Bush's answer to education back in 2001. 10 years later, a Gallup poll shows that Americans increasingly think that it made education worse. We take a look at the pros and cons and see how some struggling schools are managing.
This school in New Haven never met the official numeracy and literacy targets. And under the No Child Left Behind scheme, it would have been closed or restructured.
When I arrived here in the 2009-2010 school year to take over as the principal, Brennan Rogers was scoring in the bottom 10% of schools in the state of Connecticut. And only 30% of the third graders were proficient in reading, meaning they could read solidly on a third grade level.
Oh, I had 15 and 16-year-olds who were reading on a first and second grade level. That's a huge deficit in their reading. And of course, they're middle schoolers. They're defensive, they're all that, and they don't need that. So they really have to understand that you care about them.
So instead of the school being closed down, Karen Lott, the head teacher, managed to get extra funding to put the school back on its feet.
It will allow us up. From what research tells us, we know that students perform better in schools where they feel bonded to the school and where they feel that they have adults in that environment that are concerned about them and whom they can go to and ask for help. So there was a very deliberate focus on building relationships and asking teachers to do things like eat lunch with their kids.
The school instituted a whole range of other strategies too. Tailored one-on-one teaching, getting parents involved, and extending the school day. Almost 60% of teachers left. But those who stayed and those who joined the school are committed to improving outcomes for the children here.
So I feel pretty strongly that you absolutely should be held accountable for what happens in your room every single day, and you should be able to show that you moved every child at least a little bit what they're capable of, and that's why we teach.
In 2 years, the school went from the bottom to the top in terms of educational achievement, and it is now considered as something of an example of how even the worst schools can improve.
So both Democrats and Republicans agree that No Child Left Behind needs serious revision. But the US is reeling from the economic crisis, and unemployment is still a real threat to many Americans. We look at how education remains a lifeline to help people get back into work.
A year ago, a large car manufacturing plant near San Francisco closed, and Elizabeth, along with 4,500 other people, lost her job. So she went back to school.
This was my chance to actually do what I was interested in and get some better skills and work towards my real goals in life.
She was lucky enough to benefit from a state-funded program which offered up to $15,000 towards a 2-year training course. So Elizabeth enrolled on a biotechnology course at Fremont's Community College.
It's very hands-on, and it's learning the different skills. It's not so much of the general and the theory, and more career-oriented than in the past. It was more just learning, getting a general base oriented.
The threads, and then you'll have to take this. Probably half of my students from the last semester became employed either during the class or shortly afterwards in areas related to what we're teaching here.
Biotechnology is a booming sector in the San Francisco area, and Elizabeth is confident about the future.
I can at least get something entry level, and then I plan on continuing towards getting my bachelor's after I start working. And it was very important for me to get an education and to finish what I had started so many years ago.
He didn't do a whole lot, so he needs to go out again.
And Elizabeth isn't alone. All over the US, figures show that increasing numbers of mature students are going back to school.
So why did the US slip from the top of the global education charts 30 years ago? And what does the future hold? Education expert Mark Tucker talks to us about current policies and future reforms, as we will see in this interview.
Everyone agrees that education reform is needed in the US, but no one agrees about how to do it. Mark Tucker, the president of the National Center on Education and the Economy, has been monitoring American schools since the 80s.
It's not that we have slipped behind, it's that so many other countries have surged ahead. So if you think about this hand as representing the distribution of top performance to bottom performance, the United States would look something like this. Our top 10th, not so good as the top 10th elsewhere. Our bottom 10th, well below the bottom 10th of the average OECD country.
Mark Tucker points out that in the US, decision-making about education is localized and fragmented. Another complication is the way American schools are funded, both from the state and from local taxation.
If you're lucky enough to live in a school taxing jurisdiction which is full of people who have lots of money and very expensive homes, they can tax themselves at a very low rate and produce an awful lot of money for their schools because they have so much money. At the other end of the spectrum in the United States, there are the people who can afford very little for their housing. They have to tax themselves at a very high rate to produce a very small amount of money for their schools.
Everyone agrees that No Child Left Behind needs revision. But how?
The Republicans would prefer methods that relied much more on free market competition. And it's made fairly dramatic with respect to how the $25 billion or so of federal funds set aside largely for poor and handicapped kids would be used by the two candidates.
Obama would give the money to state schools, but Romney would give it to families.
Whether the amount of money in the voucher would be enough to come even close to the per capita cost of actually educating a student in a wealthy community, we don't know.
So where is the answer going to come from?
Maybe in due course, we will have enough humility to go and look at those who are beating the pants off us and figure out how they did it.
What about you? What do you think about American plans for education reform? Goodbye from me and the Learning World team.
Learning World in association with WISE, an initiative of Qatar Foundation.